Winter, 1241. The frozen plains of Hungary stretch silent under a grey sky. Across the ice-locked rivers and snow-covered fields, European scouts bring reports that sound like fever dreams. An army is coming from the east. Not just an army, but something no Christian kingdom has faced before. They move faster than horsemen should move. They strike where no force should be able to strike. They coordinate across distances that should make communication impossible, and they have never lost. The Mongols are 3 weeks from the gates of Vienna. King Bela IV of Hungary has assembled what he believes is a substantial force, perhaps 15,000 knights and men-at-arms, supported by Hungarian levies and Croatian auxiliaries. His commanders have trained in the tournaments and campaigns of feudal Europe. They know how cavalry charges work. They know how to hold a line. They know the rules of medieval warfare as it has been practiced for centuries across Christendom. But the Mongols are not playing by those rules. In April, at the Battle of Mohi, Bela's army will be effectively destroyed in a single day. Historians estimate perhaps 10,000 Hungarian dead, maybe more. The Mongol casualties are negligible. This is not unusual. This is the pattern. In 1223, at the Kalka River, a Mongol reconnaissance force shattered a combined army of Russian princes and Cuman tribesmen. In 1237, they returned in strength and methodically dismantled the principalities of Rus, one fortified city after another. Vladimir fell. Ryazan burned. Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, was reduced to rubble by 1240. In 1241 alone, the Mongols fought 2 major battles in Central Europe, Liegnitz in Poland and Mohi in Hungary, on the same day, separated by hundreds of miles, and won both decisively. Their coordination was flawless. Their intelligence was superior. Their speed was unmatched. Medieval armies facing the Mongols discovered they were fighting an opponent who operated on fundamentally different principles. European cavalry expected to meet enemy cavalry, lock into formation, and decide the issue through disciplined shock combat. The Mongols refused that combat. They used composite bows with effective ranges far beyond European expectations, maneuvered with precision across vast spaces, and employed feigned retreats that drew pursuers into prepared kill zones. When European knights charged, Mongol tumans, units of 10,000 horsemen, simply melted away, peppered the advancing line with arrows, then wheeled back to encircle and destroy. This was not cowardice. This was battlefield calculus executed with ruthless efficiency. And it worked everywhere. The Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful Muslim states of the early 13th century, collapsed between 1219 and 1221. The Mongols besieged cities that had resisted other conquerors for generations, Samarkand, Bukhara, Herat, and reduced them methodically, often using captured engineers and siege expertise absorbed from previous conquests. The Jin dynasty in northern China, which had fielded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, fell piece by piece to Mongol campaigns that lasted decades. The Song dynasty would follow. The Abbasid Caliphate itself, the symbolic centre of Islamic civilization, would be obliterated when the Mongols took Baghdad in 1258. By the middle of the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Poland. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. And the question facing every medieval state on its periphery was not whether the Mongols could be stopped, but whether resistance was even possible. Here's the thing, they were stopped. Not everywhere, not permanently, but in specific places, under specific conditions, by forces that learned how to neutralize the Mongol advantages. This is not a story about miracle victories or legendary heroes. This is a story about what happened when medieval commanders finally understood the structural problem they faced and adapted their strategy accordingly. The decisive factor was not superior courage or divine intervention. It was fortifications, logistics, and preparation, practical responses to a practical military challenge. But to understand how that worked, we need to go back. Back to before the Mongols arrived at the gates of Europe. Back to the moment when medieval armies first encountered this enemy and learned in the most brutal way possible exactly what they were up against. The Kalka River, May 1223. A Mongol force under Yebe and Subutai, 2 of Genghis Khan's most capable generals, has been operating in the Caucasus for months, raiding, probing, gathering intelligence. The Russian princes receive word that these eastern horsemen are approaching their territory. Prince Mstislav of Kiev, Prince Mstislav of Chernigov, and Prince Mstislav of Galicia gather their retinues. They mobilize perhaps 80,000 men, combining Russian heavy cavalry, infantry levies, and Cuman tribal warriors who have been displaced by the Mongol advance. The numbers favour the Russians heavily. The terrain is open steppe, which should allow their cavalry to manoeuvre. They cross the Dnieper River and march east with confidence. The Mongols retreat. For 9 days they fall back ahead of the Russian advance, refusing battle, drawing the coalition deeper into unfamiliar territory. The Russian commanders interpret this as weakness. They believe the Mongols are fleeing. They press forward, eager to catch and destroy this enemy before it can escape entirely. On May 31st, near the Kalka River, the Mongols stop retreating. They turn, form battle lines and attack. What happens next shatters the Russian understanding of steppe warfare. The Mongol force, perhaps 20,000 horsemen, maybe fewer, engages the Russian vanguard with archery at distances the Russians did not expect. Mongol composite bows, reinforced with horn and sinew, outrange the weapons available to most Russian troops. The arrows come in waves, disciplined and sustained, not wild volleys but controlled fire directed at specific formations. When Russian cavalry charges, the Mongol units execute coordinated withdrawals, refusing close combat, maintaining distance, continuing to shoot. The charges break up, horses fall, men dismount and try to advance on foot, but they are too slow, too exposed. The Cuman auxiliaries break first. They wheel away from the Mongol archery and flee westward, crashing through the Russian formations behind them, spreading panic. The Russian princes try to rally their forces, but the Mongol encirclement is already forming. Units that had been withdrawing minutes earlier now reappear on the flanks and rear, completing a tactical envelopment that cuts the Russian army into isolated groups. The Mongols do not charge into melee unless the enemy is already disorganized. They maintain mobility, maintain range, and methodically destroy coherence. By the end of the day, the Russian coalition is shattered. Thousands are dead. The princes who survive are captured. According to the chronicles, Subutai has them placed under wooden boards and suffocated beneath the weight of a victory feast, a message, deliberate and brutal, about the cost of resistance. This is the first major encounter between the Mongols and the medieval states of Eastern Europe, and it establishes a pattern. The Mongols do not win because they have more men. They win because they operate inside a decision cycle that their opponents cannot match. They gather intelligence before battle through extensive scouting networks. They coordinate across distances using relay riders and signal systems. They use terrain and mobility to control engagement range, and they exploit the tactical rigidity of their enemies, forces trained to fight in set-piece battles with clear lines and predictable sequences. But the Kalka River is a raid, not an invasion. After the battle, Jiba and Subutai withdraw eastward, back through the Caucasus, returning to the main Mongol armies in Central Asia. The Russian principalities are left reeling, but they are not occupied. The Mongols have demonstrated their capability, gathered intelligence on the region, and moved on. It will be 14 years before they return, and when they return, it will not be a reconnaissance force. It will be a full-scale conquest. In 1237, Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and commander of the Western Mongol armies, launches the invasion of Rus with perhaps 50,000 horsemen, supported by engineers and siege specialists. The target is not a single battle, but the systematic subjugation of the entire region. The campaign begins in winter, which is itself unusual. European armies typically avoid winter campaigns because of supply difficulties and the hardship of moving large forces through snow and frozen ground. The Mongols use winter deliberately. Rivers freeze solid, becoming highways for cavalry. Swamps and marshes that would be impassable in summer are now traversable. The frozen landscape favours mobility, and mobility is the Mongol advantage. The first target is the city of Ryazan, a fortified stronghold on the Oka River. The Prince of Ryazan, Yuri Igorovich, refuses Mongol demands for tribute. In December 1237, Batu's forces surround the city. Spring 1241. 2 Mongol armies cross the Carpathian Mountains into Central Europe. The northern force, under Baidar and Kadan, drives into Poland. The southern force, commanded by Batu Khan himself with Subutai as chief strategist, moves into Hungary. This is not a raid. This is coordinated invasion across a front spanning hundreds of miles, executed with precision that European commanders find incomprehensible. The Mongols are operating in unfamiliar terrain, far from their supply bases, yet they move with confidence and speed. European scouts report sightings, but by the time armies mobilize to respond, the Mongols have already shifted position. They are everywhere and nowhere, In Poland, Duke Henry II of Silesia gathers his forces at Lenica, called Liegnitz in German sources. He commands perhaps 25,000 men, a substantial army by the standards of medieval Poland. His force includes Polish heavy cavalry, Teutonic knights, and contingents from various allied principalities. Henry knows the Mongols are coming, he knows their reputation, but he also knows that if he does not fight, the Mongols will devastate his lands unopposed. On April 9th, 1241, he marches out to meet them. The Battle of Legnica follows the pattern established at the Kalka River, but with refinements. The Mongols deploy in their standard formation, multiple tumens arranged in flexible lines with clear command structure and communication. They open with archery, targeting the Polish infantry and lighter cavalry first, forcing them to either advance or stand under sustained fire. When Henry's heavy cavalry charges, the Mongol front line withdraws in apparent disorder. The knights pursue, gaining confidence, believing they are driving the enemy from the field. This is deliberate. The Mongol retreat is controlled, coordinated, drawing the Polish cavalry forward into prepared ground, where Mongol reserve units wait on the flanks. The encirclement closes. Mongol horsemen wheel in from both sides, cutting off the Polish line of retreat. The knights are surrounded, subjected to archery from multiple directions, unable to close with an enemy that refuses sustained melee. European sources mention smoke, possibly gunpowder or some incendiary device, used to create confusion and mask Mongol movements. The details are unclear, but the outcome is not. Henry's army is destroyed. The Duke himself is killed in the fighting. His head is later displayed on a spear. The Mongols suffer casualties, but nothing approaching the devastation inflicted on the Polish force. After the battle, they do not occupy Poland. They raid, burn, and withdraw, moving south to link up with the main Mongol force in Hungary. On the same day, 300 miles to the southeast, King Bela IV of Hungary faces the second Mongol army at the Battle of Mohi. Bela has mobilized a force comparable in size to Henry's, perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 men, anchored by Hungarian heavy cavalry and supported by contingents from Croatia and other allied regions. He knows the Mongols are in his territory. He knows they're dangerous, but he does not know where they are or when they will strike. On April 10th, Bela camps his army on the plain west of the Sajo River, near the village of Mohi. He posts guards. He believes he has chosen defensible ground. He is wrong. The Mongols attack at dawn. Subutai, commanding the operation, has already identified the river crossing and scouted the Hungarian positions. He divides his force. One column, under Batu, crosses the stone bridge at Mohi directly, engaging the Hungarian vanguard in a frontal assault. This is the diversion. While Bela's attention is focused on the bridge, Subutai takes the main Mongol force downstream, forges the river at a shallow point, and completes a wide envelopment of the Hungarian camp. By the time Bela realizes what is happening, Mongol cavalry are already forming up on his flank and rear. The Hungarian army is trapped in its own camp. The Mongols surround the position on three sides and begin systematic destruction using archery and catapults, loaded with explosive or incendiary projectiles. The Hungarian knights attempt to break out, but the Mongol lines hold. Then, deliberately, Subutai opens a gap in the encirclement to the west, creating an apparent escape route. The Hungarians pour through it, abandoning formation, fleeing toward the Danube. This is the kill zone. As the Hungarian army disintegrates into a retreating mob, Mongol cavalry pursue, cutting down fleeing soldiers for miles. The slaughter continues into the afternoon. Estimates of Hungarian casualties range from 10,000 to 15,000 dead. Bela escapes with a small retinue, but his army is annihilated. 2 battles, same day, both decisive Mongol victories. This is the operational capability that terrifies medieval Europe. The Mongols are not just winning battles, they are winning battles simultaneously across distances that should make coordination impossible. They are using intelligence networks that identify enemy positions before engagement. They are employing feigned retreats and encirclement tactics that European commanders recognize too late to counter. And they are doing all of this in terrain they have never fought in before against enemies they have only recently encountered. After Mohi, the Mongols occupy Hungary for months. They do not establish permanent control, but they demonstrate capacity. They raid as far west as the outskirts of Vienna. They send scouting parties into Austria and Dalmatia. European rulers begin preparing for the inevitable invasion deeper into Christendom. Pope Gregory IX calls for a crusade against the Mongol threat. King Louis IX of France begins mobilizing resources. Emperor Frederick II of the Holy Roman Empire sends warnings and requests for intelligence. The assumption across Europe is that the Mongols will continue west, that they will strike at Germany, Italy, France. The assumption is that nothing can stop them, and then they withdraw. In December 1241, news reaches the Mongol commanders in Hungary that Ögedei Khan, the Great Khan and supreme ruler of the Mongol Empire, has died in Karakorum. Batu and the other Mongol princes are obligated to return east for the Kurultai, the assembly that will elect the next Khan. The invasion of Europe is suspended. The Mongol armies pull back through Hungary, across the Carpathians, and return to the steppes. They do not come back. The invasion that threatened to overrun all of Christendom simply stops, not because of military defeat, but because of political necessity thousands of miles away. Europe interprets this as divine intervention. The chroniclers write that God has saved Christendom from the scourge of the East. But the military reality is clear. The Mongols were not defeated. They were not even slowed. They withdrew because of internal politics, not external pressure. And the question remains, if they had continued, could anyone have stopped them? The answer, as it turns out, is yes. But not through the methods that failed at Kalka, Lednica and Mohi. Not through open-field battles between cavalry armies. Not through the traditional tactics of feudal Europe. The answer lay in a different approach entirely, one that had already been tested, successfully, thousands of miles to the south, in a theatre of war that most European commanders knew nothing about. Syria and Egypt, 1260. 19 years after the Mongol withdrawal from Europe, the empire has continued its expansion in other directions. Hulagu Khan, another grandson of Genghis, commands the Mongol forces in the Middle East. He has just completed the destruction of Baghdad, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city fell in February 1258, after a siege that lasted less than 2 weeks. The Caliph was executed, allegedly rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses to avoid spilling royal blood directly. Estimates of civilian deaths in Baghdad range from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands. The largest library in the Islamic world was burned. The Mongols demonstrated once again that no city was safe, no dynasty was secure, no amount of historical prestige provided protection. Hulagu's army moves west into Syria. Aleppo falls in 1260 after a brief siege. Damascus surrenders without significant resistance, its governor choosing submission over destruction. The Mongol advance seems unstoppable, the pattern repeating exactly as it did in Rus and Central Europe. Muslim chroniclers describe the terror spreading through the region. The Mongols are approaching the borders of Egypt, the last major Islamic power that has not yet submitted or been conquered. The Mamluk Sultanate, based in Cairo, is preparing for war. But the Mamluks are not like the Russian princes or the Hungarian king. They are a military regime, not a feudal monarchy. Every Mamluk soldier is a trained slave warrior, purchased as a youth, educated in the barracks, and raised specifically for combat. The Mamluk cavalry are professional horsemen who practice mounted archery and close combat skills daily. They are not knights who train occasionally between estate management and political obligations. They are full-time soldiers whose entire identity is built around military capability, and their commander, Sultan Qutuz, understands exactly what he is facing. Qutuz does not march out to meet the Mongols in open steppe. He does not attempt to replicate the tactics that failed in Europe. Instead, he consolidates his forces, prepares defensive positions, and waits. In July 1260, Hulagu receives news that Munka Khan, the reigning Great Khan, has died. Hulagu takes the bulk of his army and withdraws east, leaving behind a smaller force under the general Kitbuka to hold Syria. This is the opportunity. The Mongol force in Syria is isolated, perhaps 20,000 men, far from reinforcements. Qutuz marches north, with a Mamluk army of similar size. On September 3rd, 1260, the two armies meet at Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, in the Jezreel Valley in modern-day northern Israel. The terrain is not open steppe, it is broken ground with hills, vegetation and limited sightlines. The Mamluks use this. General Baibars, commanding the Mamluk vanguard, engages the Mongol scouts and forward units, then executes a feigned retreat, deliberately drawing the Mongols deeper into the valley. This is the Mongol tactic, used against them. The Mongol cavalry pursues, expecting the same collapse they have seen in dozens of previous battles. Instead, they find the main Mamluk army deployed in defensive positions on favourable ground. The battle is brutal and sustained. Unlike European knights who charge once and then struggle to regroup, the Mamluks fight in waves, using mounted archery to match Mongol firepower, then closing for melee when the opportunity arises. The Mongol feigned retreats, which worked so effectively against less experienced enemies, fail against Mamluk cavalry who recognize the tactic and refuse to break formation. The fighting lasts hours. Both sides suffer heavy casualties, but by the end of the day, the Mongol line breaks. Kitbuka is killed, either in combat or shortly after capture. The Mongol force retreats east in disorder. The Mamluks pursue, but cautiously, not allowing themselves to be drawn into an ambush. Ain Jalut is the first major open-field defeat the Mongols have suffered in the west. It is also the first time a medieval army has successfully countered Mongol tactics in a pitched battle. But the Mamluk success is not a miracle. It is the result of specific structural factors. The Mamluks are professional cavalry who can match Mongol mobility and archery. They have commanders who understand Mongol tactics because they have studied previous Mongol campaigns and adapted. They choose terrain that limits Mongol maneuverability, and they fight a numerically isolated Mongol force, not the full strength of a Mongol invasion army. This is the critical point. The Mamluks do not defeat the Mongol Empire. They defeat a detached Mongol force under specific circumstances. When the Mongols return in strength over the following years, the Mamluks do not meet them in open battle repeatedly. They defend fortified positions, conduct limited engagements, and avoid decisive confrontations unless the conditions favour them. The border between Mamluk Egypt and Mongol-controlled territory stabilises, not because the Mamluks have found a way to decisively defeat Mongol armies in the field, but because they have found a way to make conquest prohibitively costly. And this is the lesson that some medieval commanders in other regions are beginning to understand. You do not beat the Mongols by meeting them on open ground in a climactic cavalry battle. You do not beat them by charging their formations with heavy cavalry. You do not beat them by assembling a larger feudal host and marching out to defend your territory in a single decisive engagement. You beat them, or more accurately you survive them, by changing the nature of the conflict itself, by denying them the open field battles they excel at, by forcing them to expend time and resources on sieges, by making every mile of advance costly, every city a delay, every campaign a logistical challenge. This understanding emerges slowly, unevenly, and often too late. But it does emerge. And nowhere is it more clearly demonstrated than in the regions where the Mongols faced their most frustrating and incomplete conquests, not in the open steppes or river valleys of Rus, not in the plains of Hungary, but in the fortified zones of Eastern Europe and the Middle East, where defenders had time to prepare, infrastructure to exploit, and walls thick enough to matter. The fortress cities that survived Mongol siege warfare did not survive because their walls were impregnable. They survived because the Mongols, for all their tactical brilliance and operational sophistication, faced the same fundamental constraint that limited every pre-modern army: time. Sieges consume time. Long campaigns drain horses. Extended occupation requires supply lines. And supply lines, stretched across thousands of miles of hostile or neutral territory, are vulnerable. The key example is not in the Middle East. It is in Central Europe, in a region the Mongols invaded but never fully controlled. The Duchy of Austria, the Kingdom of Bohemia, and the fortified cities of the Holy Roman Empire faced Mongol raids in 1241 and 1242, but they did not collapse the way Hungary did. The difference was not courage or superior troops, the difference was infrastructure. Austria, under Duke Frederick II, had fortified cities with stone walls, castles positioned to control key river crossings, and a network of defensive positions that forced any invader to either besiege strongpoints or bypass them and leave hostile garrisons in their rear. The Mongols probed Austrian defences during their occupation of Hungary, sending raiding parties west to gather intelligence and test responses. They found fortified towns that could not be taken quickly. They found supply depots protected by walls. They found a landscape where mobility was constrained by terrain, and where speed could not substitute for siegecraft. The Mongols did not commit to a full invasion of Austria. They raided, gathered intelligence, and withdrew. This was pragmatic calculation. The Mongol strategy relied on rapid conquest, on taking cities fast enough to prevent coordinated resistance, on moving before the enemy could concentrate forces. In Austria, that strategy faced obstacles. Every fortified town required a siege. Every siege required time and resources. and time was the one thing the Mongol operational model could not afford to waste in large quantities. They were an army built for movement, for campaigns measured in weeks and months, not years of grinding attrition. Bohemia, under King Wenceslaus I, followed a similar pattern. When news of the Mongol invasions reached Bohemia in early 1241, Wenceslaus mobilized his forces, but he did not march them into Hungary to meet the Mongols in open battle. He concentrated them in fortified positions, strengthened city defences, and prepared for a siege-based defensive campaign. The Mongols sent scouts into Bohemian territory, but never launched a major invasion. The calculus did not favour it. Bohemia was heavily forested, dotted with fortified towns, and positioned such that a Mongol advance would stretch supply lines without offering immediate strategic gains. This is the structural factor that begins to matter in 1241 and becomes decisive in later encounters. The Mongols can defeat any medieval army in open battle if they can force that battle on favourable terms, but they cannot defeat fortified infrastructure without significant time investment, and when they commit to sieges they lose their primary advantage. A Mongol tumen besieging a city is a Mongol tumen that is not manoeuvring, not scouting, not exploiting mobility. It is sitting in place, exposed to attrition, consuming supplies, wearing down horses. The cities that survived Mongol sieges did so because their defences imposed delay. Ryazan fell in 5 days, but Ryazan was a wooden-walled city with limited garrison and no prospect of relief. Kiev held for weeks because its defences were stronger and its garrison more determined, but it still fell because no relief force arrived and the Mongols had the siege equipment to breach the walls. The cities that did not fall, or that fell only after months of effort, were the ones with stone fortifications, adequate supplies, and realistic expectations of holding out long enough for the strategic situation to change. Consider the case of the Song dynasty in southern China. The Mongols began their campaigns against the Song in the 1230s, and the conquest was not completed until 1279, nearly 50 years of sustained warfare. The Song had fortified cities, canal networks that facilitated supply and communication, and a terrain dominated by rivers and rice paddies that limited Mongol cavalry mobility. The Mongols won, eventually, but the conquest required a complete adaptation of their military system. They built river fleets, they recruited Chinese siege engineers, they invested decades in systematic reduction of Song strongpoints. The speed and mobility that characterized Mongol victories in the steppes were largely irrelevant in southern China. The Mongols had to fight a different kind of war, and it took them half a century. The same principle applied in Eastern Europe, though the timescales were different. After the Mongol withdrawal in 1242, the states of Central and Eastern Europe had nearly 2 decades to prepare for a potential return. Some of them used that time effectively, others did not. Hungary, devastated by the 1241 invasion, rebuilt under King Bela IV with a focus on fortifications. Bela sponsored the construction of stone castles across Hungary, replacing wooden fortifications with structures designed to resist siege. The counterpoint to this defensive success is what happened in regions where fortifications did not exist or were inadequate. The steppes of southern Rus, the open plains of Ukraine and the northern Caucasus, remained under Mongol control for generations. These were territories where the Mongol military system functioned optimally: open terrain suited to cavalry warfare, sparse population that could not support large-scale rebellion, and no urban infrastructure capable of resisting sustained pressure. The Mongol successor state known as the Golden Horde dominated this region from the mid-13th century into the 15th century, not through constant military occupation, but through control of key cities, taxation of subject populations, and the credible threat of punitive campaigns against anyone who resisted. The difference was structural: a principality with stone-walled cities, stockpiled supplies, and a network of mutually supporting fortresses could resist. A principality dependent on field armies and wooden palisades could not. This was not a question of bravery or tactical skill. It was a question of whether your infrastructure could impose costs on the attacker sufficient to make conquest uneconomical. The Mongols were not irrational. They did not throw armies at fortified positions for symbolic reasons. They calculated. If a city could be taken quickly, they took it. If a city would require months of siege, and there were easier targets elsewhere, they bypassed it or negotiated. This calculus is visible in the Mongol campaigns in Anatolia and the Middle East during the latter half of the 13th century. After Ain Jalut, the border between the Mongol Ilkhanate and the Mamluk Sultanate stabilized into a zone of intermittent warfare, with neither side able to achieve decisive conquest. The Mongols launched multiple invasions of Mamluk territory, in 1281, in 1299, in 1303, but none resulted in permanent territorial gains. The Mamluks, for their part, raided Mongol-controlled Syria but did not attempt to reconquer Baghdad or push deep into Ilkhanate territory. The reason was logistical. The Mamluks had fortified cities along their northern frontier, Gaza, Jerusalem, Damascus when they recaptured it, that served as supply bases and staging points for campaigns. The Mongols could raid past these cities, but they could not sustain deep penetration into Egypt without securing their supply lines. And securing supply lines meant taking fortified cities, which meant sieges, which meant time. The Mamluks, conversely, could not sustain campaigns deep into Mesopotamia without facing the same constraints. The result was a strategic stalemate based on the friction of distance and fortification. The Battle of Marj al-Safar in 1303 illustrates this. A Mongol army under Kutlug Shah invaded Mamluk Syria with perhaps 80,000 men, a substantial force. The Mamluks, under Sultan al-Nasir Muhammad, gathered perhaps 60,000 and met the Mongols near Damascus. The battle was a Mamluk victory, but it was hard fought and costly. Both sides used mounted archery. Both sides employed tactical withdrawals and encirclement attempts. The Mamluks won because they had better intelligence on Mongol positions, because they held the ground near their own supply base, and because they maintained formation discipline under pressure. After the battle, the Mongols retreated east. They did not return in force to Syria for years. The campaign had failed to achieve strategic objectives, and the cost had been high. This is the mature phase of Mongol warfare, not the sweeping conquests of the 1220s and 1230s, but the attritional campaigns of the late 13th and early 14th centuries, where Mongol armies are still formidable, but no longer unstoppable. The difference is that their opponents have adapted. The Mamluks are professional cavalry who can match Mongol tactics. The fortified cities of Eastern Europe have walls thick enough to resist quick assault. The logistical networks of settled states, roads, supply depots, fortified magazines, allow defenders to sustain campaigns in their own territory more effectively than Mongol invaders can sustain campaigns far from their bases. And there is another factor, less dramatic but equally important: horses. The Mongol military system depended on horses, not just as mounts, but as a logistical foundation. Each Mongol warrior travelled with multiple horses, rotating them to maintain speed and endurance. Mongol campaigns consumed horses at a staggering rate, through exhaustion, injury, disease, and combat. In the steppes, horses could graze on natural pasture. In forested or heavily cultivated regions, fodder had to be requisitioned or carried. Long campaigns in non-steppe terrain wore down the Mongol cavalry base in ways that were difficult to replace quickly. This is why Mongol campaigns tended to be short and decisive. Speed was not just a tactical preference, it was a logistical necessity. A Mongol army could move faster and farther than any contemporary force, but it could not stay in the field indefinitely without access to pasture and remounts. When Mongol invasions stalled, when cities resisted longer than expected, when supply lines were harassed, when the campaign extended into months rather than weeks, the Mongol advantage eroded. The horses weakened, the mobility decreased, and without mobility the Mongol tactical system lost its foundation. The fortified cities that held out against Mongol sieges were not just denying the Mongols a victory, they were imposing time costs, and time costs translated into horse attrition, supply consumption, and strategic vulnerability. A Mongol army besieging a city for 3 months was a Mongol army that could not respond to threats elsewhere, could not raid for supplies, could not maneuver to avoid enemy concentrations. It was pinned, and pinning a Mongol army negated its core strength. This is the practical lesson that medieval commanders eventually learned. You cannot outmaneuver the Mongols, you cannot outshoot them, you cannot meet them in open battle with a feudal levy and expect to win. But you can force them into sieges, you can deny them mobility, you can make conquest slow and expensive, and if you do that consistently, across multiple strongpoints, you create a defensive network that is more costly to overcome than the territory is worth. The Kingdom of Serbia provides an instructive example. The Mongols raided Serbian territory multiple times during the 13th century, but they never conquered Serbia outright. Serbian fortifications were positioned in mountainous terrain, difficult to approach and resupply for a besieging force. The Serbian rulers, particularly King Stefan Dragutin and King Stefan Milutin, maintained fortified monasteries and castles stocked with supplies and garrisoned with professional soldiers. When Mongol raids came, Serbian forces withdrew to these strongpoints and waited. The Mongols raided the countryside, extracted plunder where they could, and moved on. Serbia was not a priority target worth the investment of a prolonged campaign, and its fortifications made quick conquest impossible. This was not victory in the heroic sense. The Serbs did not drive the Mongols from the field in glorious battle, but they survived. They preserved their political independence. They avoided the fate of the Rus principalities, which were subjugated and forced to pay tribute for generations. And they did so through infrastructure, preparation, and the strategic logic of making conquest more trouble than it was worth. The broader pattern is clear. The regions that successfully resisted or limited Mongol conquest were regions with fortified urban centres, professional or semi-professional military forces, and logistical infrastructure that allowed sustained defence. The regions that fell quickly were regions that relied on field armies, open terrain warfare, and the assumption that numerical superiority or knightly valour would be sufficient. That assumption was wrong. The Mongols rewrote the rules of medieval warfare, and only those who adapted to the new rules survived. The adaptation was not uniform, and it was not always conscious. Many medieval states fortified their cities for reasons that had nothing to do with the Mongol threat: internal conflicts, rivalries with neighbours, the general insecurity of the medieval political landscape. But when the Mongols appeared, those fortifications suddenly became the difference between survival and annihilation. The infrastructure built for one purpose served another, more critical function. Consider the citadels of the Caucasus. The kingdoms of Georgia and Armenia faced repeated Mongol invasions starting in the 1220s. Georgia, under Queen Rusudan, initially resisted, fielding armies that attempted to meet the Mongols in open battle. Those armies were destroyed. The Mongols devastated Georgian territory in 1221, again in 1236 and repeatedly through the 1240s. But Georgia did not disappear. Georgian fortresses in the mountains, Vardzia, Tmogvi, Kertvisi, held out. These were not simple castles. They were fortress complexes carved into cliffsides, accessible only by narrow paths, supplied by mountain springs, stocked with grain sufficient for months or years. The Mongols could ride past them, but they could not take them without investment of time and resources that the strategic situation did not justify. Georgia became a tributary state, forced to pay taxes to the Mongol Ilkhanate and provide troops for Mongol campaigns. But it retained internal autonomy, its nobility survived, and its fortifications remained intact. This was not the outcome Georgia wanted. It was, however, better than the outcome that befell states with no fortifications at all. Tributary status was humiliating, but it was survivable. Complete conquest with the accompanying destruction of urban centres and elimination of native leadership was not. The Mongol Empire itself understood this dynamic. As the 13th century progressed, Mongol strategy shifted. The early campaigns, Genghis Khan's invasions of China and Central Asia, the conquests of Rus and the Middle East, aimed at total subjugation through overwhelming force and terror. Cities that resisted were destroyed utterly as examples. Populations were massacred to discourage future resistance. This was not irrational cruelty. It was strategic messaging. Surrender immediately and live under Mongol rule. Resist and face annihilation. But by the mid-13th century, the Mongols were governing vast territories, and governance required functional cities, tax revenue, and trade. Destroying every city that resisted was counterproductive. The later Mongol successor states, the Golden Horde in the west, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, increasingly relied on negotiated settlements, tributary relationships, and incorporation of local elites into the Mongol administrative structure. This was pragmatism. A city that paid tribute was more valuable than a city reduced to rubble. This shift benefited defenders with fortifications. If a city could hold out long enough, if its walls were strong enough, and its supplies adequate, the Mongols might negotiate rather than assault. This was not guaranteed, but it was possible, and possibility was better than the certainty of destruction that faced unfortified settlements. The siege of Qiangyang in southern China demonstrates the full extent of what sustained siege warfare cost the Mongols. Xiangyang was a fortified Song dynasty city on the Han River, strategically positioned to block Mongol access to the Yangtze River Valley. The Mongols besieged it starting in 1268. The siege lasted 5 years. 5 years of continuous investment, with Mongol forces encircling the city, constructing siege engines, attempting assaults, and blockading river access. The Song garrison held. Relief forces attempted to break the siege multiple times. The Mongols built counter-fortifications, hired Muslim engineers to construct advanced trebuchets, and systematically tightened the blockade. Xiangyang fell in 1273, but the cost was immense. 5 years of a Mongol army tied down in front of a single city, thousands of casualties, resources diverted from other campaigns, and even after Xiangyang fell, the Song dynasty continued to resist for another 6 years. The conquest of Song China, one of the wealthiest and most populous states in the world, required decades of attritional warfare, naval battles, and siege operations that bore no resemblance to the swift cavalry campaigns that had brought down the Khwarezmian Empire or the Rus principalities. This is the fundamental constraint. The Mongols could conquer anything given enough time and resources, but time and resources were finite. A siege that lasted 5 years was a siege that prevented 5 years of other conquests. A campaign that dragged on for decades was a campaign that consumed the lifespan of commanders, the patience of political leadership, and the coherence of strategic planning. The Mongol advantage was operational tempo, and anything that slowed tempo reduced the advantage. In Europe, this reality was never fully tested after 1242. The Mongols withdrew from Hungary and never returned in full force. The reasons were political: succession crises, internal conflicts within the Mongol Empire, the division of the empire into separate khanates with competing interests. But the strategic calculation was also clear. Further conquest of Europe would require sustained campaigns against fortified cities in terrain that limited cavalry mobility, far from Mongol population centres and supply bases. The effort required was disproportionate to the reward. The Golden Horde, which controlled the western steppes, focused its attention on the Rus principalities and the Black Sea trade routes. These were economically valuable, strategically accessible, and militarily manageable. The Rus princes were kept divided through selective support and punitive raids. They paid tribute, they provided troops when demanded. But they were not occupied in the sense that Mongol administrators governed every town. The Mongol system relied on indirect control, domination through threat, taxation through local intermediaries, and intervention only when resistance became significant. This system worked in the open steppes and in regions without strong fortifications. It worked less well in areas where cities could resist and where local populations had defensible refuges. The Principality of Novgorod, in northwestern Rus, avoided direct Mongol conquest entirely. Novgorod was distant, swampy, heavily forested, and fortified. The strategic value of conquering it did not justify the effort. Novgorod paid tribute to avoid conflict, but it was never occupied, and its internal autonomy remained largely intact. The Mongols calculated that forcing submission through threat was sufficient, and that actual conquest would be costly and unnecessary. This is the broader strategic lesson. The Mongol Empire was not defeated by a single climactic battle or a coalition of European powers. It was limited by the same factors that limited every empire in history: logistics, distance, and the friction of governing vast territories. The states that survived Mongol expansion were the states that made conquest prohibitively expensive through fortification, defense in depth, and the willingness to absorb raids without collapsing politically. The irony is that the Mongols themselves understood this. Their own empire was built on mobility and speed, but it was sustained by infrastructure, roads, relay stations, postal systems that allowed communication across thousands of miles. The YAM system, the Mongol courier network, was one of the most sophisticated logistical achievements of the medieval world. It enabled Mongol commanders to coordinate operations across continents, to receive intelligence quickly, and to respond to threats with remarkable speed. But even the YAM system had limits. Messages could travel faster than armies, but armies still needed to eat, and horses still needed to rest. The medieval states that learned to exploit these limits, that built fortifications to impose time costs, that avoided decisive open battles in favour of attritional defence, that coordinated mutual support between fortified strongpoints, found that the Mongols were not invincible. They were simply operating under different constraints, and if you understood those constraints, if you built your defensive strategy around exploiting them, you could survive. The surviving records from the period reveal a gradual shift in how medieval commanders thought about the Mongol threat. Early encounters produced terror and confusion. The speed, coordination, and tactical discipline of Mongol armies seemed supernatural. Chroniclers described them as a divine punishment, a scourge sent to chastise Christendom for its sins. There was no tactical analysis, no attempt to understand the operational methods behind Mongol success. There was only shock and the assumption that resistance was futile. But by the 1260s and 1270s, after multiple campaigns and years of observation, a more pragmatic understanding emerged. Military treatises from the period, Arabic texts from Mamluk commanders, Byzantine accounts, later European sources, begin to describe Mongol tactics in concrete terms. The feigned retreat is identified as a deliberate maneuver, not a sign of weakness. The encirclement tactics are recognized as standard practice. The reliance on archery and mobility is noted along with recommendations for how to counter it. These are not perfect analyses, and they are not always correct, but they represent a shift from panic to study. The Mamluk military manual known as the Nihayat al-Sul, written in the late 13th century, includes detailed sections on fighting steppe nomads. It advises maintaining formation discipline, avoiding pursuit of retreating cavalry, preparing fortified camps at night, and using terrain to limit enemy mobility. It describes the Mongol composite bow and recommends training cavalry and mounted archery to match Mongol firepower. It discusses logistics, supply security, and the importance of intelligence networks. This is not mystical or symbolic advice. This is practical military doctrine based on experience. Byzantine sources from the same period reflect similar thinking. The Byzantines, whose empire had been reduced to a fraction of its former size by the Fourth Crusade and subsequent conflicts, faced Mongol pressure in Anatolia and along the Black Sea. They did not have the military strength to fight major battles, but they had fortified cities and diplomatic skill. Byzantine strategy relied on negotiation, tribute payments, and playing different Mongol factions against each other. The Byzantines survived not through military victory but through political maneuver and the defensive value of Constantinople's massive walls. The Mongols never seriously attempted to besiege Constantinople, and the Byzantines never gave them a reason to make the attempt a priority. This diplomatic dimension is often overlooked, but it was critical. Medieval states facing the Mongol threat had limited options. Open battle was usually suicidal. Siege defense was effective but exhausting. The third option was negotiation, offering submission, tribute, or alliance in exchange for survival. This was not cowardice, it was rational calculation. If you could not defeat the Mongols militarily, and if your fortifications could not guarantee survival indefinitely, then accommodating Mongol demands was preferable to annihilation. The Rus principalities adopted this strategy throughout the 13th and 14th centuries. They paid tribute to the Golden Horde, sent their princes to the Mongol capital at Sarai to receive approval and investiture, and provided troops for Mongol campaigns when required. In exchange, they retained internal governance, religious autonomy, and economic continuity. The Orthodox Church, in particular, benefited from Mongol tolerance. The Mongols generally exempted clergy from taxation and allowed religious practice to continue without interference, a policy that helped maintain social stability in occupied territories. This tributary system was not stable or uniform. Mongol demands varied depending on political circumstances within the Golden Horde. Russian princes competed for Mongol favour, sometimes betraying rivals to curry favour with their overlords. Punitive raids occurred whenever tribute was delayed or rebellion threatened. The city of Tver was sacked in 1327 after an uprising against Mongol tax collectors. The destruction was thorough, the message clear, but the system persisted because both sides benefited. The Mongols extracted wealth without the cost of direct occupation. The Rus principalities preserved their basic social and political structures. Over time, this arrangement eroded. The Golden Horde fragmented in the 14th century due to internal succession conflicts and the impact of the Black Death, which devastated the Mongol population as thoroughly as it devastated Europe. The Rus principalities, particularly Moscow, grew stronger and more independent. By the late 14th century, Moscow was challenging Mongol authority directly. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, where a coalition of Russian princes under Dmitry Donskoy defeated a Mongol army led by Mamai, marked a turning point. The Mongols returned and sacked Moscow 2 years later, but the precedent had been set. Russian victory over the Mongols was possible. Kulikovo was not a flawless triumph. The Russian forces suffered heavy casualties, and the strategic situation remained complex. But the battle demonstrated that Mongol military dominance was no longer absolute. The Mongols were fighting with the same tactics they had always used, but the Russians had adapted. They fielded a combined arms force with cavalry, infantry and archery contingents. They chose defensive terrain that limited Mongol mobility. They maintained formation discipline and avoided the reckless pursuits that had destroyed earlier Russian armies. The Mongols still had tactical skill, but they no longer had overwhelming advantage. The final expulsion of Mongol authority from Russian territory took another century. Moscow's Grand Prince Ivan III formally renounced tributary obligations to the Golden Horde in 1480. The Mongols, weakened by fragmentation and internal conflict, could not enforce compliance. The Great Stand on the Ugra River in 1480 saw Russian and Mongol forces facing each other across the river for months, neither willing to force a decisive engagement. Eventually the Mongols withdrew. It was an anticlimax, but it ended 2.5 centuries of Mongol dominance over Rus. This slow erosion of Mongol power was not unique to Russia. Across the former Mongol Empire, the successor Khanates faced similar trajectories. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed in the 1330s due to succession disputes and economic decline. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia fragmented into competing factions. The Yuan dynasty in China was overthrown by the Ming in 1368. The Golden Horde split into smaller khanates, Crimea, Kazan, Astrakhan, that retained Mongol identity but lacked the military capacity of the unified empire. By the 15th century, the Mongol Empire as a unified political and military entity no longer existed. The reasons for this collapse were multiple. Environmental factors played a role. The Black Death killed millions across Eurasia and disrupted the trade networks that had enriched the Mongol Khanates. Political fragmentation was inevitable, given the size of the empire and the lack of strong centralized succession systems. Economic changes shifted trade routes and reduced the strategic importance of the steppe corridors the Mongols controlled. But military adaptation by their opponents also mattered. The states that survived Mongol conquest learned over generations how to limit Mongol effectiveness. They built fortifications, trained professional armies, adopted gunpowder weapons, and developed defensive strategies that made conquest unsustainable. Gunpowder technology in particular changed the calculus. Early cannons and handguns were unreliable and often as dangerous to their users as to the enemy, but by the 15th century, gunpowder artillery was effective enough to breach fortifications that would have resisted medieval siege engines. Gunpowder technology in particular changed the calculus. Early cannons and handguns were unreliable and often as dangerous to their users as to the enemy, but by the 15th century, gunpowder artillery was effective enough to breach fortifications that would have resisted medieval siege engines. This development benefited both attackers and defenders, but it disproportionately harmed the Mongols. Gunpowder weapons required manufacturing infrastructure, supply chains for powder and ammunition, and trained specialists. These were assets that settled, urbanized states possessed, and nomadic steppe empires did not. The military advantage that mobility and horsemanship had provided for centuries was being eroded by technology that favored industrial capacity over individual skill. The Mongol successor states adapted to some extent. The Crimean Khanate used firearms. The later Timurid Empire, descended from Mongol traditions but culturally and militarily distinct, employed gunpowder artillery in sieges. But the fundamental shift had occurred. The open steppe, which had been the source of Mongol strength, was becoming strategically marginal. The centres of power were shifting to the fortified cities and industrialized economies of Europe, the Middle East, and China. The age of nomadic cavalry empires was ending, not because of a single defeat, but because the structure of warfare itself was changing. The question remains, what made the Mongol military system so effective in its prime, and why did specific defences work when so many others failed? The answer lies in understanding the Mongol operational model not as superior tactics alone, but as a complete military system designed around information, logistics, and tempo. Mongol armies did not simply ride faster than their opponents. They knew more. Before any major campaign, Mongol commanders sent scouts and intelligence agents into target territories, sometimes years in advance. These operatives gathered information on geography, political divisions, military capabilities, economic resources, and potential routes of advance. By the time a Mongol army crossed the border, its commanders often knew more about the enemy's territory than the enemy's own rulers did. This intelligence advantage allowed Mongols to identify weak points, exploit divisions between rival factions, and strike at moments of maximum vulnerability. The invasion of Khwarezm in 1219 exemplifies this. Genghis Khan spent months gathering intelligence on the Khwarezmian Empire before launching the attack. He knew which cities were strongly fortified and which were vulnerable. He knew that Sultan Muhammad II had fractious relationships with his military commanders and provincial governors. He knew the locations of supply depots, the conditions of roads, and the seasonal patterns of river levels. When the invasion began, Mongol columns moved with precision, bypassing strong points to strike at logistics hubs and isolated garrisons. The Khwarezmian defences collapsed not because their troops were cowardly, but because the Mongols dismantled the command structure and supply network before decisive battles even occurred. This integration of intelligence into operations was rare in medieval warfare. Most medieval armies operated with minimal reconnaissance, relying on local guides and outdated information. Commanders made decisions based on assumption and tradition rather than current intelligence. The Mongols built intelligence gathering into their military culture. Every officer was expected to scout, report, and update commanders on enemy movements. The Yam courier system ensured that information flowed quickly from the front lines to senior commanders, allowing rapid adjustment of plans. Logistics reinforced this advantage. Mongol armies travelled light compared to medieval European forces. A Mongol warrior carried minimal personal baggage: dried meat, curd, fermented mare's milk, a bow, arrows, and basic tools. The horses provided mobility and, in extremis, food. When Mongol armies moved, they moved fast, covering distances in days that would take European armies weeks. This speed allowed them to concentrate forces where needed, strike before the enemy could prepare, and disperse before effective counterattacks could be organised. But this logistical efficiency had limits. Horses required pasture or fodder. Extended campaigns in regions without adequate grazing strained the Mongol supply system. Winter campaigns in Rus exploited frozen rivers and reduced fodder needs because horses could dig through snow to reach grass beneath, but even this had limits. Prolonged sieges consumed time and resources, eroding the logistical cushion that made rapid movement possible. The Mongols excelled at campaigns measured in weeks or months. Campaigns that stretched into years, like the conquest of Song China, required logistical adaptations that reduced Mongol mobility and negated many of their tactical advantages. The defensive systems that worked against the Mongols exploited these logistical constraints. Fortified cities with stockpiled food could outlast Mongol siege efforts. Networks of castles positioned 1 or 2 days' march apart forced the Mongols to either besiege each one, consuming time and horses, or bypass them and accept hostile forces in their rear. Terrain that limited grazing or restricted movement to narrow passes reduced Mongol mobility to the point where their tactical advantages disappeared. The Hungarian defensive network built after 1241 was designed specifically around this logic. King Bela IV positioned his new stone castles to control river crossings and major roads, ensuring that any Mongol invasion would face a series of fortified obstacles rather than a single decisive battle. Each castle was garrisoned and supplied to resist siege independently, but they were close enough to provide mutual support. A Mongol force besieging one castle would be vulnerable to sorties from neighbouring garrisons. A Mongol force bypassing the castles would find its supply lines harassed, and its mobility constrained by the threat of attack from fortified positions. This was not a revolutionary concept. Fortification networks had existed in various forms throughout medieval history, but the specific application, using fortifications not to win battles but to impose time and supply costs on an enemy built for speed, was adapted to counter the Mongol threat. It worked because it denied the Mongols the operational tempo they required. A Mongol army moving quickly through open terrain was nearly unstoppable. A Mongol army pinned in front of a fortress, consuming fodder, losing horses to disease and exhaustion, and vulnerable to harassment, was just another medieval army with no decisive advantages. The Mamluk success at Yin Jalut and subsequent battles also relied on negating Mongol advantages rather than matching them directly. The Mamluks trained extensively in mounted archery, not because they could outshoot the Mongols, but because they could shoot well enough to prevent the Mongols from controlling engagement range unopposed. Mamluk cavalry practiced formation discipline and coordinated maneuvers daily, building the muscle memory needed to avoid breaking apart under Mongol feigned retreats. Mamluk commanders studied Mongol tactics from captured prisoners and defectors, learning to recognize the patterns that had destroyed less prepared armies. When the Mamluks fought the Mongols, they fought on ground they had chosen, with supply lines they controlled, using tactics designed to counter specific Mongol methods. They did not win every engagement. Mongol forces defeated Mamluk armies multiple times in the late 13th century, but they won enough to prevent conquest. The border stabilized because neither side could achieve decisive superiority. The Mongols could raid Mamluk territory but could not hold it. The Mamluks could defend their core territories but could not push deep into Mongol-controlled regions. The result was a military equilibrium based on mutual capability and logistical limits. This equilibrium was the norm for successful resistance against the Mongols, not the exception. The dramatic narratives, Ain Jalut Kulikovo, the Siege of Xiangyang, are memorable because they were significant battles, but the broader pattern was attritional stalemate. The Mongols conquered where conquest was logistically feasible and strategically valuable. They withdrew or accepted tributary arrangements where conquest was too costly. The states that survived were not necessarily those that won the most battles, but those that made continued warfare economically irrational. European states were fortunate that the Mongol withdrawal in 1242 came before the full test of this dynamic. The fortifications built in Hungary, Austria and Bohemia after 1241 were never subjected to the sustained pressure that fortifications in China or Persia endured. The Mongol invasions of the 1280s tested the defences but did not commit the full resources of the Golden Horde. We cannot know with certainty whether the Hungarian castle network would have held against a determined multi-year Mongol campaign comparable to the Siege of Xiangyang, but the fact that the Mongols did not launch such a campaign suggests that their commanders calculated the effort would exceed the gain. This is the strategic lesson. The Mongols were not stopped by miracle or by military genius on the part of their opponents. They were stopped by the fundamental economics of pre-modern warfare. Conquest requires more resources than defense. Holding territory requires more effort than raiding it. Sustaining armies far from home requires logistics that even the most sophisticated medieval empire could barely manage. The Mongols pushed these limits further than any previous power, but they could not transcend them. And the medieval states that understood this, that built their defences around imposing costs rather than winning glory, found that survival was possible. The broader impact of the Mongol invasions on medieval military thought is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The Mongols forced a reckoning with assumptions that had governed European warfare for centuries. The idea that heavy cavalry was the decisive arm of battle, that fortifications were refuges of last resort rather than active strategic tools, that battles should be fought at close quarters with shock and valour determining the outcome. All of these assumptions were challenged by an enemy that refused to fight according to those rules. The response was uneven. Some regions learned quickly, others did not. Hungary rebuilt with fortifications because it had experienced invasion directly and understood the cost of being unprepared. Poland fortified its major cities and reorganized its military structure after the raids of the 1240s and 1280s. The Mamluk Sultanate professionalized its military training and created institutions specifically designed to produce cavalry capable of fighting steppe nomads. These were adaptations driven by necessity, by the immediate threat of conquest or annihilation. But Western Europe, largely untouched by direct Mongol invasion, did not adapt in the same way. France, England, and the Iberian kingdoms continued to fight wars using the feudal levy system and heavy cavalry charges that had proven inadequate against Mongol tactics. They had no pressing reason to change because they never faced the Mongols in battle. The lessons learned in Eastern Europe and the Middle East did not transfer effectively to regions where the threat remained theoretical. Military adaptation requires pressure, and Western Europe did not feel that pressure. This created a divergence in military development across the continent. Eastern European states, particularly those on the frontier with the steppe, developed lighter cavalry, improved fortification networks, and began experimenting with combined arms tactics that integrated infantry, cavalry, and missile troops more effectively. Western European states remained committed to the knightly ideal, the mounted warrior in plate armour, the decisive cavalry charge. These were effective enough against other Western European armies, but they would have been vulnerable to Mongol tactics had the Mongols ever turned their full attention westward. The same pattern repeated in other theatres. The Song dynasty in China, after decades of war with the Mongols, developed sophisticated siege defences, river fleets, and gunpowder weapons specifically to counter Mongol advantages. The Song did not win the war. The Mongols eventually conquered them, but they prolonged resistance far beyond what earlier Chinese dynasties had managed. The military innovations developed during the Song-Mongol Wars influenced Chinese military doctrine for centuries afterward. In the Islamic world, the Mamluk experience fighting the Mongols shaped military education and training for generations. Mamluk Furusiya literature, the body of texts on horsemanship, archery and military arts, includes detailed instructions on fighting steppe cavalry, maintaining formation under arrow fire, and recognizing feigned retreats. These texts were copied, studied, and disseminated across the Islamic world, influencing military practice from Egypt to Central Asia. The Mongol threat, even after it receded, left a lasting impact on how Islamic armies trained and fought. The technological response to the Mongol invasions also deserves attention. Gunpowder weapons, which had existed in rudimentary form in China for centuries, spread westward during the 13th and 14th centuries, partly through Mongol intermediation. The Mongols themselves used gunpowder in siege warfare, employing explosive projectiles and incendiary devices captured or adapted from Chinese sources. When these weapons appeared in the Middle East and Europe, they were initially curiosities, unreliable and difficult to manufacture. But over time they evolved into effective siege artillery that could breach walls faster than traditional catapults or trebuchets. This had profound implications for the fortification-based defensive strategies that had proven effective against the Mongols. A castle that could resist a months-long siege using medieval siege engines might fall in days to sustained cannon bombardment. The defensive advantage that fortifications provided eroded as gunpowder technology improved. By the 15th and 16th centuries, military engineering shifted toward new types of fortifications, star forts with angled bastions designed to resist cannon fire, that were more expensive and complex than medieval castles. The arms race between fortification and siege technology continued, but the balance had shifted. The Mongol impact on this technological evolution was indirect but significant. The Mongol Empire facilitated trade and communication across Eurasia, creating networks that allowed the transfer of knowledge, including military technology. Gunpowder, silk, paper, and countless other innovations moved along the trade routes the Mongols controlled. The Pax Mongolica, the relative peace and security within Mongol territories during the empire's peak, enabled merchants, scholars, and craftsmen to travel farther and more safely than they had in previous centuries. This exchange accelerated technological diffusion, including military technologies that would eventually undermine the very cavalry-based warfare at which the Mongols excelled. There is an irony here. The Mongol Empire, built on the supremacy of mounted archery and mobility, created conditions that facilitated the spread of technologies that would make mounted archery obsolete. Gunpowder weapons, once refined, were more effective than bows. Infantry armed with pikes and firearms could resist cavalry charges that would have broken medieval levies. Fortifications designed to withstand cannon fire were too expensive and complex to be overrun by rapid cavalry maneuvers. The military system that made the Mongol conquest possible was gradually rendered obsolete by developments that the Mongol Empire itself had indirectly encouraged. This transformation took centuries. The last remnants of Mongol military tradition persisted into the 16th and even 17th centuries in the form of successor states like the Crimean Khanate, which continued to raid Eastern Europe using cavalry tactics descended from the Mongol model. But these were diminishing returns. The Crimean Tatars could raid, but they could not conquer. They could threaten, but they could not impose their will on states with gunpowder artillery and standing armies. The world had moved on. The strategic lesson that emerged from the Mongol invasions was not a simple formula. It was not build more castles, or train better cavalry, or even adopt gunpowder weapons. It was a recognition that military superiority is contextual, that advantages are situational, and that adaptation requires understanding the specific conditions that make certain tactics effective. The Mongols were dominant in open terrain, with good intelligence and rapid mobility. They were vulnerable in fortified zones with prepared defences and limited grazing. Understanding this allowed medieval states to craft strategies that exploited Mongol weaknesses rather than confronting Mongol strengths. This lesson applies beyond the specific case of the Mongols. Throughout military history, the most successful defensive strategies have been those that deny the attacker the conditions they need to leverage their advantages. The Greeks at Marathon chose terrain that negated Persian cavalry. The Vietnamese in the 20th century used jungle and tunnel networks to negate American firepower and mobility. The principle is consistent. Do not fight the enemy's battle. Force them to fight yours. The medieval states that survived the Mongol invasions understood this, whether consciously or through painful experience. They built fortifications, stockpiled supplies, trained professional soldiers, and avoided the decisive open-field battles that the Mongols excelled at. They made conquest slow and expensive. They imposed time costs that the Mongol logistical system could not sustain indefinitely. And when the Mongol Empire fragmented for internal political reasons, these states were positioned to reassert independence because their infrastructure and military capabilities had survived intact. This was not heroism. It was not the triumph of Christian virtue over pagan barbarism, as some medieval chroniclers framed it. It was practical, strategic adaptation based on recognizing what worked and what did not. The states that adapted survived. The states that did not, that relied on outdated tactics, insufficient fortifications, and the assumption that courage would overcome operational deficiency, were conquered or forced into humiliating tributary relationships. The difference was not moral or spiritual, it was structural. The human cost of this learning process was immense. The Mongol invasions killed millions. Entire cities were erased. Populations were enslaved or massacred. Agricultural regions were devastated by raiding. Their productivity collapsed for years or decades. The psychological trauma extended across generations. Chronicles from the period describe populations living in constant fear, villages abandoned at the first rumour of Mongol approach, refugees fleeing westward with stories of destruction that seemed apocalyptic in scale. The city of Merv in Central Asia reportedly had a population of several 100,000 before the Mongol siege in 1221. After the city fell, the population was systematically executed over several days. The numbers reported by chroniclers, some claim over 1 million dead, are almost certainly exaggerated, but even conservative estimates place the death toll in the tens of thousands. Merv never recovered its former importance. It remained a provincial town, a shadow of what it had been. This pattern repeated across Eurasia. Nishapur, Herat, Baghdad, Kiev, cities that had been centres of culture, commerce and learning, were reduced to ruins or dramatically diminished in size and significance. The agricultural devastation was equally severe. Mongol armies destroyed irrigation systems in Persia and Mesopotamia, regions where agriculture depended on carefully maintained canals and watercourses. The destruction was not accidental, it was strategic, designed to deny resources to enemies and demonstrate the cost of resistance. But the long-term consequences were catastrophic. Regions that had supported dense populations for millennia became depopulated. Agricultural productivity declined and did not recover for centuries. The economic impact rippled outward, disrupting trade networks and impoverishing regions far from the areas of direct conflict. The demographic impact is harder to quantify because medieval population records are incomplete and unreliable. But historians estimate that the Mongol invasions contributed to population decline across much of Eurasia in the 13th century. Some of this decline was due to direct violence, battles, massacres, sieges. Some was indirect, famine caused by agricultural disruption, disease spread by population displacement, economic collapse that reduced birth rates and increased mortality. The Black Death, which struck Eurasia in the mid-14th century, found populations already weakened by decades of warfare and instability, possibly contributing to its devastating impact. Yet the Mongol invasions also created opportunities. The Pax Mongolica, despite the violence that preceded it, fostered trade and cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. Merchants travelled from Europe to China along routes secured by Mongol authority. The Silk Road, which had been intermittently disrupted by local conflicts for centuries, became safer and more heavily trafficked during the height of Mongol power. Marco Polo's journey to China in the 1270s was possible because Mongol rule provided safe passage through Central Asia. The exchange of goods, ideas and technologies that occurred during this period influenced developments across Eurasia. This does not justify the violence. It does not make the Mongol conquests morally acceptable or the suffering they caused less real. But it complicates the narrative. The Mongol Empire was not simply a destructive force. It was a reorganization of Eurasia's political and economic geography, achieved through brutal conquest, but resulting in integration that had profound long-term effects. The question of whether this integration could have been achieved through less violent means is unanswerable, but worth considering. History does not offer controlled experiments. For the medieval states that survived, the memory of the Mongol invasion shaped policy and military doctrine for generations. Russia's political development was profoundly influenced by 2.5 centuries of Mongol domination. The centralized autocracy that characterized Muscovite Russia and later the Russian Empire borrowed organizational concepts from Mongol governance. The emphasis on rapid communication, centralized tax collection, and strong military authority all had precedence in the Mongol system. This is not to say that Russian autocracy was simply Mongol rule continued by other means, but the influence is undeniable. In Eastern Europe, the emphasis on fortification and defensive networks that emerged after the Mongol invasions influenced urban development and military architecture for centuries. The castle-building programs initiated by Bela IV in Hungary and similar efforts in Poland and Bohemia created landscapes dotted with fortified strongpoints that shaped how wars were fought in the region well into the early modern period. These fortifications were built to resist Mongol cavalry, but they proved equally useful against other threats: Ottoman invasions, internal conflicts, dynastic wars. The Mamluk Sultanate, which successfully resisted Mongol conquest, became the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean for over 2 centuries. The military system that allowed them to fight the Mongols effectively, professional cavalry, rigorous training, emphasis on horsemanship and archery, remained the foundation of Mamluk power until their defeat by the Ottomans in 1517. The Mamluks are remembered for stopping the Mongols at Ain Jalut, but their longer-term significance lies in how they institutionalized the lessons learned from that conflict into a durable military system. The Mongols themselves adapted. The successor Khanates that emerged after the empire's fragmentation each developed differently. The Golden Horde maintained a nomadic steppe empire model for over a century, dominating the Pontic-Caspian steppe and extracting tribute from the Rus principalities. The Ilkhanate in Persia converted to Islam and adopted Persian administrative practices, becoming a sedentary empire that bore little resemblance to the original Mongol confederation. The Yuan dynasty in China attempted to govern using Mongol methods, but found that ruling a vast agricultural empire required bureaucratic systems that the traditional Mongol political structure could not provide. When the Yuan fell, the Ming dynasty that replaced it retained some Mongol administrative innovations while rejecting others. The question of what would have happened if the Mongols had continued their European invasion in the 1240s is ultimately speculative, but the evidence suggests that prolonged conquest would have been difficult. The fortifications being built in Hungary, the defensive preparations in Bohemia and Austria, the political fragmentation of the Holy Roman Empire that made centralized resistance difficult, but also made total conquest nearly impossible, all of these factors would have complicated Mongol operations. The Mongols might have conquered additional territory, they might have extracted tribute from more European kingdoms, but the likelihood of them overrunning Western Europe in the same way they overran the Rus principalities or Khwarezmia seems low, given the structural differences. Western Europe was more densely fortified, more urbanized, and more fragmented politically than the regions the Mongols had successfully conquered. Each major city would have required a siege. Each kingdom would have required separate campaigns. The distances from the Mongol power base in Central Asia to France or Germany would have strained even Mongol logistics. The climate and terrain of Western Europe, more forested, wetter with less open grazing, favoured defensive warfare over the cavalry operations at which the Mongols excelled. None of these factors made Mongol conquest impossible, but collectively they made it extremely expensive in time and resources. And time was the constraint that ultimately limited the Mongol Empire more than any military defeat. The empire was born from the genius of Genghis Khan and sustained by the organizational skills of his immediate successors, but it required continuous expansion to maintain cohesion. The Mongol political system rewarded military success with land and authority. When expansion slowed or stopped, the pressure for internal redistribution increased, leading to succession conflicts and fragmentation. The death of Ugadai Khan in 1241, which triggered the withdrawal from Europe, was only the first of several succession crises that progressively weakened central authority. By the time the empire fragmented in the mid-13th century, it had already achieved the maximum extent that any single political entity could govern with pre-modern communications and transportation. The AM system was remarkably efficient, but it could not overcome the fundamental limitations of distance and time. A message from the Great Khan in Karakoram to a general in Persia took weeks. A decision made in the capital might be obsolete by the time it reached the frontier. Local commanders operated with substantial autonomy, which was necessary for effective command but also created conditions for independent power bases. The Mongol Empire's collapse was not a military defeat. It was a political fragmentation driven by the impossibility of governing a territory that large with medieval technology. The Khanates that emerged from the fragmentation remained powerful for decades or centuries, but they were regional powers, not a unified world empire, and as regional powers, they faced the same strategic constraints as other medieval states. They had to balance expansion against consolidation, conquest against governance, military capability against economic resources. The final assessment requires perspective. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century represented the collision of two military systems, the nomadic cavalry model perfected by steppe empires over centuries, and the fortification-based sedentary model developed by agricultural civilizations. For a brief period, the Mongol system achieved decisive superiority. But that superiority was not permanent, and it was not absolute. It was situational, dependent on conditions that could be altered through infrastructure, preparation, and strategic adaptation. The medieval armies that faced the Mongols learned, slowly and at terrible cost, that survival required changing the conditions of engagement. You could not defeat Mongol cavalry in open steppe warfare, but you could deny them the open steppe. You could force them into siege warfare where their mobility was irrelevant. You could impose time costs through fortifications and defense in depth. You could train professional soldiers capable of recognizing and countering Mongol tactics. And you could accept, when necessary, that tributary status or negotiated settlement was preferable to annihilation. These lessons were not always implemented effectively. Many states learned them too late or not at all. But the states that survived, Hungary after reconstruction, the Mamluk Sultanate, the fortress cities of Eastern Europe, eventually the rising Principality of Moscow, were those that understood the structural nature of the challenge and responded with structural solutions. They did not rely on heroism or divine intervention. They built walls, stockpiled grain, trained cavalry and mounted archery, and avoided battles they could not win. This is not the narrative that medieval chroniclers preferred. Chronicles celebrated heroes, divine judgment, and decisive battles. They described the Mongols as a scourge sent by God, and their defeats as divine deliverance. But the practical reality was more mundane. The Mongols were stopped by logistics, by fortifications, by the economic calculation that conquest beyond a certain point was not worth the cost. They were stopped by defenders who refused to fight on Mongol terms and instead imposed their own conditions, slow, attritional warfare that negated the advantages of mobility and speed. The broader lesson extends beyond the medieval period. Military advantage is never permanent. Every tactical innovation eventually meets a counter. Every strategic system has vulnerabilities that can be exploited by opponents who understand those vulnerabilities and adapt accordingly. The Mongols were not invincible, even at the height of their power. They were exceptionally effective under specific conditions, but those conditions could be changed. For medieval Europe, the Mongol threat shaped military development in ways that persisted long after the immediate danger had passed. The emphasis on fortification, the professionalization of military forces, the integration of different troop types into combined arms formations, all of these developments were accelerated or influenced by the need to counter an enemy that could not be defeated using traditional methods. The Europe that emerged from the shadow of the Mongol invasions was militarily different from the Europe that existed before them, not because Europeans had become better warriors, but because they had learned to fight wars differently. The cost of that education was measured in ruined cities, depopulated regions, and countless individual tragedies. The chronicles record the names of kings and battles, but they cannot capture the full human impact. The families destroyed, the livelihoods lost, the futures erased by violence. The Mongol invasions were not a story of heroic resistance culminating in glorious victory. They were a prolonged catastrophe that some regions survived through adaptation and infrastructure, while others were conquered or reduced to tributary status. But survival mattered. The states that survived preserved their cultures, their languages, their political traditions. They passed on their knowledge and institutions to successor generations. They eventually reasserted independence when Mongol power declined. The fortifications they built, the military doctrines they developed, the strategic lessons they learned, all of these endured and influenced how wars were fought in subsequent centuries. The Mongol Empire itself, for all its devastating impact, was a historical anomaly. It required the unique combination of Genghis Khan's leadership, the military traditions of the steppe peoples, and the political fragmentation of their opponents. When those conditions changed, when Mongol unity fractured, when opponents adapted, when new technologies emerged, the empire could not sustain itself. It fragmented, declined, and was eventually absorbed into other political systems. The legacy remained in genetics, in cultural exchange, in the political structures of successor states, but the empire as a unified force disappeared. This is the reality of military power. It is contextual, temporary, and vulnerable to adaptation. The Mongols were not the first empire to achieve regional dominance through military innovation, and they were not the last to discover that advantages erode when opponents learn and adapt. The medieval armies that faced them were not heroes in the romantic sense. They were survivors who learned practical lessons under extreme pressure and passed those lessons forward. If there is strategic wisdom to extract from this history, it is this: understand the nature of the threat you face. Do not fight the enemy's battle. Do not confront their strengths directly. Identify their vulnerabilities, logistical, temporal, structural, and build your defense around exploiting those vulnerabilities. Prepare infrastructure before the crisis arrives, because improvisation under pressure rarely succeeds. Accept that survival may require patience, attrition, and a willingness to avoid decisive confrontation until conditions favour you. The medieval states that followed these principles survived. Those that did not were conquered. It was not fate. It was not divine will. It was the consequence of strategic choices made under extraordinary pressure, with incomplete information and terrible stakes. Some chose well, some chose poorly. Some had the resources to implement effective defences, others did not. But across decades of conflict, a pattern emerged. Fortification, preparation, and denial of enemy advantages worked. Everything else failed. This documentary has traced the course of those conflicts, from the initial shock of Mongol invasion through the gradual adaptation of defenders who learned to survive. It has emphasized the structural factors, fortifications, logistics, terrain, time, that determined outcomes more reliably than valor or tactics. It has shown that the Mongol military system, for all its sophistication, had limits that could be identified and exploited. And it has demonstrated that military history is not a sequence of heroic narratives, but a process of adaptation, innovation, and strategic calculation, where survival goes to those who understand the game being played. The day medieval armies faced the Mongols was not a single day. It was decades of conflict, thousands of engagements, countless sieges and skirmishes. Some defenders prevailed, many did not. But over time, the survivors learned. They built walls thick enough to matter. They trained soldiers capable of fighting on terms other than those the Mongols preferred. They made conquest expensive enough that the Mongols chose easier targets or negotiated rather than forcing total subjugation. And when the Mongol Empire fragmented for political reasons beyond the control of its enemies, those who'd survived found that the infrastructure and knowledge they had developed gave them the foundation to rebuild. If you found this examination of medieval warfare and strategic adaptation valuable, leave a comment about which aspect of the Mongol campaigns you found most interesting. The interplay between tactical brilliance and logistical constraints shapes military outcomes across all periods of history, and understanding that dynamic offers insight into conflicts far beyond the medieval era. The Mongols changed medieval warfare, but medieval warfare in turn found ways to limit and eventually contain the Mongol threat. Neither side achieved total victory. Both sides adapted, and the process of adaptation, more than any single battle or campaign, determined the shape of Eurasia for centuries to come.